Hi listener, this is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ego and ideological doctrine in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. Today, I'm doing a reading of Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics by Bernardo Castrup. So, we've gotten to chapter 10, which is individuality and disassociation. Life has been created quite truthfully in order to surprise us, where it does not terrify us altogether. Rainer Maria Rilke in a letter written in the late 19th or early 20th century. So, for Schopenhauer, our seemingly individual subjectivity is merely an epiphenomenon of the universal will, a form of its manifestation, not a fundamental or primary entity. He writes, "Death is a sleep in which individuality is forgotten. Everything else awakens again, or rather has remained awake." Interesting. So, there's a universal will of which we are just a secondary manifestation of. Sounds like the law of one and Gnosticism to me. Individuality being forgotten, our sense of ego, a full sense of self, well, death is a sleep, but in a way, it's kind of an awakening in the sense that you're waking up from the sleep of life or the sleep of incarnation. So when you have a dream, you have this sense of who you are in the dream, and it might be different from who you are regularly. Dreams can be quite fantastical. And just as we've got this spiritual sense of who we are, and we're acting out this play, act, with this false identity, a false egoic identity. And to some extent, we kind of choose what it will be beforehand. So, but there's a part of us deep down inside, like you could call it the soul, the self, or what have you, that has always remained awake. I suppose you could link that even to the higher self, but fundamentally, seems like Schopenhauer got it. He got it. So individuality is akin to a thought that can simply be forgotten, a transitory experience arising and dissipating in something that always remains awake, i.e. consciousness, the universal will itself. Does that sound New Age to you? He clarifies that the individual does not rest on a self-existing unit. So there's a collectivity to existence where we are fundamentally connected to the whole. We are not merely individuals. Not that we're not individuals, but that our individuality is part of a larger whole, a larger unity. He clarifies that the individual does not rest on a self-existing unit, i.e. the individual doesn't exist in or by itself, in the same way that, e.g., a thought doesn't exist in or by itself, but is simply a particular manifestation of the underlying mind. Indeed, later on, Schopenhauer speaks of individuality as a mere condition or state of the will. It has only a conditioned, in fact, properly speaking, a merely apparent reality. Well, I'm inclined to agree with that. There's a video I watched the other day, I can't remember who by, but they made the point that, in a sense, each of us is like a fingerprint on a finger of God. There's an infinite number of fingers. So Source has all these fingers and all these fingerprints, and we're just one of those. That's a really interesting point. And I do feel like it links to what was being discussed here, that we are just one unit or one part of an overall whole here. Therefore, for Schopenhauer, the existence of multiple individual subjects is an illusion, for there is only one being. True, but there are multiplicity of forms which the whole can take. After all, the whole, the one, is all of the possibilities are contained within the one, and therefore there's not going to be a limit to its manifestations. It's limitless, it's boundless. So why would it limit it and bound itself to anything? Which means inevitably they're going to do all these different manifestations, which happen to be us. Well, not happen to be, inevitably are us. Nevertheless, simultaneously, there was only one being. The law of one remains true, despite all the multiplicity. For there was only one being in nature. Only the unitary universal will is ultimately real. Individual subjects being just something the will does. Individuals are experiential actions or behaviors of the will. I've got this idea that our experience is largely, it's like where the attention of source is, except the attention of source isn't in one place. It's in many, many places. And we experience part of the overall experience of the whole of source. But when we have experience, we're in a sense in experiencing as source, just we're not experiencing all of ourselves, perhaps. The question that then immediately confronts us is, just how does this will do this? What is the mechanism by means of which it does multiple individual subjects concurrently? How is the illusion conjured up? We know that the experiential states of individual subjects are not integrated across their respective psyches. Otherwise, we would be able to read each other's thoughts and access each other's memories and feelings. Although, that does seem to be what a social memory complex entails, which we, as in humanity, will become. Perhaps, since time is an illusion, that future has already come to pass. It just hasn't manifested in our experience yet. This disruption of and/or discontinuity in the normal integration, Black and Grant, 2014, of the universal will's experiential states is analogous to what is called disassociation in modern psychiatric parlance. American Psychiatric Association, 2013. Severe forms of disassociation can cause a person to manifest multiple seemingly disjoint personalities or centers of consciousness called alters in what has become known as dissociative identity disorder, or DID, also known as multiple personality disorder. Recent neuroimaging research has objectively and compellingly confirmed the reality of DID, e.g. Schlumpf et al. 2014, Strasburger and Waldvogel 2015. I submit that implicitly in Schopenhauer's argument is the notion that individual subjects arise analogously to alters as a consequence of a DID-like disassociation of the universal will. Now, Bernardo Kastrup isn't the only person to have made this suggestion. I mean, it has definitely been suggested before by regard to the law of one, that this is the nature of reality, that source is in a state very much like disassociation. And there is also the term of like, as above, so below. So like, there is the idea that each and every one of our minds itself is the source, it's like of a lower octave or something. So reality is trippy and fractal. Just the illusion we're under now is that it's not. After all, as we've seen, the will is consciousness, and as such can, at least in principle, undergo disassociation. We can then imagine that, through disassociating itself into multiple seemingly disjoint centers of consciousness, the will creates the illusion of individual subjectivity, just as DRD patients experience multiple seemingly separate personalities in a single mind. Though there's an interesting thought, which is like, what if it's an accident? Like, what if there's a mental patient and that mental patient is, from our perspective, God, and we're just like onto some of that mental patient? I don't see it that way, right? That would be and there's no way to confirm one way or the other. I have to admit, I suppose it's a possibility, right? Anyway. Although the seeds of the modern psychiatric understanding of disassociation were sown by Pierre Janet only after Schopenhauer's death, Schopenhauer himself already offers a cogent description of the role of cognitive associations in the ordinary integration of experiential states. He explains, without the thread of integration formed by he explains that without the thread of integration formed by how one idea draws in another by the bond of association, myriad experiential states would remain forgotten outside of our individual awareness or ego. Although, as we awaken and go to multiple levels of consciousness, we integrate more and more with other bits of consciousness. That's why we form social memory complexes as a whole planet, and then beyond that, there's a higher level of integration as you go up the densities. So it's like consciousness inherently associates and co-regulates over time. Although, what is time? So if there was a point where you could say a change was made whereby consciousness disassociated, the infinite consciousness disassociated across its infinity. And what that does, since time would be maybe a construction of that or come from that. And so, and since time is an illusion, what it means is there's an eternal reintegration process, an eternal re-association process, a recoagulation process of consciousness, and then it never ends because there's no limit to how far up, down, or whatever you can go. As for what the nature of reality would be if that disassociation never happened, who knows? But that seems to be the nature of our reality. So that it has happened. And even the idea of it happening presupposes a sense of time, or at least we see that from a perspective of those dwelling in time. Maybe there is a sense of change, that time inherently comes in change. So that change, the moment, there was a moment, an infinite moment, and then there was a change, a creation, where finity was created from infinity. Now keep in mind, infinity includes everything. So inevitably, the finite was going to come up and be created, because creation of the finite would be part of the infinite, and otherwise it wouldn't. If the creation of the finite wasn't going to happen, there wouldn't be infinity in the first place, right? It wouldn't be infinity if it wasn't inevitably going to become finite or create finite infinity. I don't know if that makes sense, but it makes sense to me. So there was an infinite moment, and then there was a change to a new state, which created time and created all of the holographic reality. And that was the beginning of time. But the thing is, just as space is infinite, so is time. So just that moment from the beginning to the end of that transition from one state to the next state, which is what time is anyway, a transition of one state to a new one. Basically, it's change manifest in a holographic sense. Because everything that's created is holographic. I might be wrong about that. That's just how I see it now. And even, I can't remember who it was, but there was this Greek mathematician who came up with this idea that there's no, the closer you get, if you go from 0 to 1, there's a way in which you can get numbers that go increasingly closer to it, but never reach it, right? And it's this idea that the more you can break it up into infinitely small pieces, and there's still more pieces you can go along, right? So between the beginning and the end of a transition, whereby there's just, it starts with just everything being one unified infinity, it ends with a different state from that, or maybe it goes back to itself. So maybe it goes into one state and then returns back to itself. That seems likely to me. So it just goes back, forward, and back again in a cycle. And so what that does is it creates, and maybe this is, well, I guess a sort of cyclical wave or something, a field. A field would be spherical anyway, right? So that kind of makes sense. So there's from the beginning to the end, there's all these infinite possibilities played out, all these infinite steps played out. And so, and yet through all that infinity, there's a constant return to, there's constantly creation occurring, making more change coming out, and there's constantly and disassociating, and there's constantly a reassociation at the same time as being to rise up to consciousness again. And so this is how consciousness gains experience. And in a sense, the moment that a change was made, all the changes were made, but there's no limit to the changes. So it's like a mode of fractal mode and unified mode, but fractal mode isn't really not unified. It's just a different manifestation of unification. Okay, I hope you're following. Yeah, it kind of pushes the limit of imagination a bit, but I had fun. That's the important thing. And would you watch this if I was super serious and just like not enjoying myself and just doing it out of a sense of duty? That'd be really boring, wouldn't it? Anyway, so where was I? Indeed, he proceeds to describe what is effectively a dissociative split between intellect and deeper layers of the will. Evocative statements like occasionally the intellect does not really trust the will suggests that Schopenhauer considered the formation of autonomous and co-conscious mental complexes hallmarks of severe disassociation and empirical matter of fact. Oh, what's this idea? Okay, the difference between intellect and will. It reminds me of the difference between ego and self, or ego and source, ego and soul. Yeah. Clearly, disassociation isn't a foreign notion to Schopenhauer. It's not a great leap, thus, to fill in the gap and posit that, in his Metaphysics, disassociation of the will, a form of universal DID, is what accounts for the illusion of individual subjectivity. Schopenhauer carefully assembles all the building blocks necessary for deriving this conclusion, stopping just short of securing it with an explicit claim. Well then, I would say that fits into what I was saying, and vice versa. So, a criticism that could be offered at this point is this: whereas we can perceive and interact directly with others' individual states in ordinary waking life, after all, I can surely see and interact with other people and animals. An author of a human DID patient cannot perceive and interact directly with another author of the same patient. There is nothing the second author looks like from the point of view of the first. The first author cannot reach out and touch the second. Well, first of all, souls interact on a regular basis in reality. Secondly, someone I know who has actually got DID or something like very much like that, yeah, they do interact with their alter. So maybe there's a type of DID where they don't, but I don't think that's the only type. There's a type where I mean, there's this idea of there's competing egos competing over which one is the real one, believing the others aren't real or fake. But I don't think that's like always how it is. And that's certainly not the case from what I've experienced. Anyway, from the outside, I mean, although technically we've all experienced it in a sense, in the sense that source is disassociated, right? How is it that I can reach out and touch other people and animals if they, like me, are analogous to authors of the universal will? The key to making sense of this is rigor in interpreting the analogy. We are likening A, a person with DID, to B, the universal will with someone analogous to DID. But remember, unlike the case of the person, there was no external world from the point of view of the universal will. The latter is, ex hypothesi, all there is, and all phenomena being internal to it. So we are comparing apples to bananas when we relate to the person's life in the outside world to the entirety endogenous inner life of the universal will. I mean, it kind of makes sense, but one thing I would disagree with here is that it relates to the law of correspondence. As above, so below, so below, so above, also applies to as within, so without, as without, so within. So there's a level in which the internal and the external and external are one and reflect each other, and them being separate is a dualistic illusion. And yet polarity exists, and so it's still a feature of reality, the internal-external split. So I would say the idea that internally it's different because in DID, it's the external world. There's an external world which they're relating to in a dissociated manner, whereas with relation to Schopenhauer's universal will concept, there's only the internal. Because the internal and the external are kind of the same thing or not really truly separate, and also because everything's fractal infinity, it means that it goes infinity in and infinity out, infinitely up, infinitely down, and every other dimension that we can't even conceive of yet. Forward, back in time, everything. So all the possibilities are within the one and the whole. And with the law of correspondence, the one and the whole is at every level. And every possibility of infinite creation exists at every level of infinite creation. It is all one and connected. So I would say Bernardo Castrup and Schopenhauer might be not quite getting the full picture here, but that's just my perspective here. Right. It is more apt to compare the latter with a person's dream life, for only then all experiential states in both cases are internally generated without the influence of an external outside world. This and only this is a fair analogy. So what do we know about the dream life of a human DID patient? Can the patient's different alters share a dream, taking different co-conscious points of view within the dream, just like you and I share a world? Can they perceive and interact with one another within their shared dream, just as people can perceive and interact with one another within their shared environment? As it turns out, there is evidence that this is precisely what happens, as research has shown. Here is an illustrative case from the literature. The host personality, Sarah, remembered only that her dream from the previous night involved hearing a girl screaming for help. Alter Annie, age 4, remembered the nightmare of being tied down naked and unable to cry out as a man began to cut her vagina. Anne, age 9, wait, let me look at the age comparisons. Okay. Anne, age 9, dreamt of watching this scene and screaming desperately for help, apparently the voice in the host's dream. Teenage Joe dreamed of coming upon the scene and clubbing the little girl's attacker over the head. And in her dream, he fell to the ground dead and she left. In the dreams of Annie, the teenager with the club appeared, struck the man to the ground, but he arose and renewed his attack again. 4-year-old Sally dreamt of playing with her dolls happily and nothing else. Oh, what does it remind me of? It reminds me of Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol has quite a good and interesting portrayal of the idea, actually. Both Annie and Anne reported a little girl playing obliviously in the corner of the room in their dreams. Although there was no definite abuser identified also manifesting at this time, the presence at times of a hallucinated voice similar to Sarah's uncle suggests there might be yet another alter experiencing the dream from the attacker's vantage. So, hopefully that clarifies things. Or maybe just raising more questions, like everything, right? Taking this at face value, what it shows is that while dreaming, a dissociated human Disassociated human mind can manifest multiple concurrently conscious alters that experience each other from second and third person perspectives, just as you and I can shake hands with one another in ordinary waking life. The author's experiences are also mutually consistent in the sense that the authors all seem to perceive the same series of events, each author from its own individual subjective perspective. The correspondences with the experiences of the individual people sharing an outside world are self-evident and require no further commentary. I have to say this seems more closer to my perspective, I would say, this bit. And there's this idea that, imagine a sort of network-shaped sphere and representing all of reality, I guess. And each perspective is just like looking at it from a certain angle. Now, I'm not going to claim credit for this idea. This is someone else's concept. I'm just using it because it's useful. And you only see part of the picture from a certain angle. But the more angles you integrate, the more holistic of a picture you get. I mean, like with satellites, often they get the satellite effect of like a big satellite, but he's getting lots of little ones. Not satellites. Well, it could work with satellites, but just detecting discs or whatever. But I can't blank about the word for some reason. Anyway, wait, did I lose track? Oh dear. So anyway, if you were to have all the perspectives and integrate them all as a unified whole, you'd have the whole perspective. I mean, you wouldn't be perspective anymore. It'd be unified consciousness, I suppose. Clearly, our empirical grasp of the extreme forms of disassociation shows that a DID-like process at a universal scale is, at least in principle, a viable explanation for how individual subjects arise from the universal will. Whether the cognitive mechanisms underlying disassociation are also conceptually understood today is but a secondary question. Whatever these mechanisms may be, we know empirically that they do exist in nature and produce precisely the right effects to explain the illusion of individuality posited by Schopenhauer. In this regard, and in many others as well, Schopenhauer's metaphysics is empirically plausible. The question now is, what counts as alters of the will? We know that human beings do. Animals do too, insofar as they are akin to us, except that they lack abstract representations. But what about plants, which react to stimuli but lack even perceptual representations? And what about inanimate objects, such as rocks and magnets, in which only the universal forces are manifest? Well then. I will add that in terms of Law of the One, I don't know if you've listened to the previous episode, but yeah, according to the Law of One, like rocks and stuff would be like first density. The animal kingdom in general would be other than us, maybe dolphins or something, would be like second density. We're third. And what we're transitioning to this Great Awakening is fourth density. Incidentally, 5-dimensional, because density and dimensions aren't the same thing, but they kind of are at the same time. So it's a different way of categorizing the same thing, and labels are ultimately just labels. So the first thing to notice is that Schopenhauer makes an uncompromising distinction between living organisms and inanimate objects. Even between the smallest lichen, the lowest fungus, and everything inorganic, there remains a fundamental and essential difference. Well, there is a difference, but also kind of isn't. So he proceeds to explain that living organisms are defined by their form, which they maintain despite a constant exchange of material between their bodies and the environment. Through feeding and secretion, Whereas inanimate objects are defined precisely by their particular material that happens to constitute them at any one point in time. Moreover, living organisms are enclosed in a skin, i.e. in a boundary of some sort. An enclosed point I shall discuss further in the next chapter, whereas an inanimate object is not. I would add this thought that, so there's this idea with the chakras and also with the tree of life in the Kabbalah and, well, the law of one, that whether it's densities or chakras or those different spheres or whatever in the tree of life, which I really could look into in more depth. When you get to the top, in a sense, it loops back again, starts over at the bottom, and in a sense, the top and the bottom are kind of one, but like different specters of the same thing, I guess. So it's kind of like a loop. So first density and eighth density, say, are pretty much like the same thing in the sense that, well, when you get down to that level, they're just, I mean, there's a form, material that's maintained, but the boundary between one grain of sand and another, there isn't really, okay, there might be kind of like a distinction, but when you really get to the small level, quantum level, the distinction between like one particle and another, or like where exactly it is, or what exactly it's moving, and that particle and others, it blurs and it becomes more about the wave pattern, or should I say the field and set of, it's almost like a set of data points, right? When there's a superposition, we're not being observed. Basically, all the possibilities are there at the same time. Essentially, yeah, it's more like the wave and the field, right? And a whole set of possibilities, all true at the same time, even if they contradict. And everything but sand on a higher level, that's kind of that effect as well, where it forms these dunes and stuff, and it's more about how they interact as a whole than them individually. But at the same time, they're kind of like a monad, which within that they have an infinity and a whole set of lower densities within them on a lower octave. And just as all of what we've got, all of what we are, could in a sense be, all of these densities could just be like within a photon or the high on the density above, on the polarity octave above us, right? Because something, when you get down to like one photon or something, just as one hand, I said that, okay, there's no boundary between them. On the other hand, if you really just look at one as a particle rather than as a wave, which you can do, it's like an unchanging one or whole, which has infinity within it, but it's just one, right? Now, what is the whole? The density, right? It's that. Everything else is like contained within it. So the very bottom level of reality is the very top level of reality. Yeah. Where was I? In the latter case, there isn't anything to separate it from the outside world, and so inanimate objects can easily be referred to fixed fundamental characteristics, which we call laws. These natural laws or forces in turn are universal, not individuated. 4. A force of nature as, e.g. gravity or electricity, must manifest itself as such in precisely the same way in all its millions of phenomena. This unity of inner being in all its phenomena is called a law of nature. And this may well relate to Hermetic laws too. Therefore, insofar as seemingly individual inanimate objects can be fully reduced to universal laws, they have unitary inner being and aren't actually individuated at all. They can't have conscious inner life disassociated from the rest of the universe. Can't they? What if they can? Now, it wouldn't be with the veil of ignorance, I don't think, but imagine being incarnated in a photon. It's kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? But perhaps it would be a state of well, almost like a state of oneness, just a sense that of things that's not changing. It'd be very simplistic. What? And I mean, you wouldn't be, you'd be experiencing very much on a pure, basic, simple level, but as a soul on a source level, reality, as your spirit body, right? You'd just be observing simple existence, and time would perhaps just feel meaningless. And after a sense of eternity, that, I mean, a subjective sense of eternity that somehow ends at some point, there'd be a change, or maybe an end of that incarnation. But the question is, what is the mirror step, or what is the lesson that in that simple state would be learned to get to the next level up? I don't know. There's a fundamental difference between, so it would have to be a reaction to an external stimuli. For a long time, there would simply be, maybe it'd be like being in a trance or something for a long time. And who knows what would be experienced, but eventually an awareness, not just an awareness of there being something external, but are starting to react to stimuli to gain energy, maybe, I don't know. Something vaguely approximating purpose might ease itself into the consciousness, or the awareness. Basically, it's learning to be material, or like a photon or whatever, but then learning how to prepare for being more than that. But all in this sense of things being time stretching along and almost feeling meaningless. That's how I kind of imagine it to be. Well, the carving out of the inanimate universe into separate things has no metaphysical basis, according to Schopenhauer. These things are just cognitively salient protuberances, as it were, of the unitary objectification of eternal and omnipresent. Like different fingerprints of infinity, of intelligent, all that is infinity. Volitional, right. Objectification of eternal and omnipresent volitional states in the form of natural forces. Schopenhauer insists the will objectifying itself in inorganic nature no longer appears here in individuals who by themselves constitute a whole, but in natural forces and their action. Although, to be honest, I would say it's still a different manifestation. It's still a manifestation of universal consciousness. It's just a different way of manifesting. In some ways simpler, but not necessarily simpler at all. The existence of distinct inanimate objects is thus merely nominal, the output of a cognitive function performed by the intellect, and already elucidated by Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason. The intellect clusters sense data into bundles, each bundle constituting a seeming object according to certain purposes. A web of cause and effect relationships is then laid on these bundles, so to link them together in a cognitively coherent manner. This way, individual inanimate objects are epistemic tools, creations of the observing individual subject that serve some cognitive purpose, as opposed to distinct entities of the inanimate world as it is in itself, inanimate world, right? So, I had in my mind this image of, I was reading that, of, okay, so these clusters of, let's say, data and consciousness bundled together rather than just being dispersed purely. They start being bundled together. Now, and they're bundled together according to associations in a web of cause and effect and laid over them and stuff like that. I got in this mind a picture of synapses firing and interacting, right? And this bundled together being like each synapse being like a bundle, right? But if you consider the comparison that has been made before between the brain and its firing synapses and clusters, the universe and clusters connected via filaments, looking very much like the brain and synapses. Well, perhaps on, I'm just, I very much saw a comparison there that it's highly analogous in a sense. And what if, hypothetically, it kind of is like that? Like it kind of is like this consciousness network between galaxies, between galactic clusters, that operates in a way very much analogous to synapses and neural pathways. So, now, if individuation of inanimate objects is merely epistemic, then again, they cannot correspond to authors of the universal will. Oh, if you say so, Bernardo. After all, disassociation has an ontic character, like relating to ontology. Whereas I can arbitrarily stipulate that a handle is integral to the mug it's attached to, I cannot just decide that the chair I am sitting on is integral to me as an individual subject. For, try as I might, I cannot immediately, i.e. without mediation, feel what happens in the chair. I can only represent the chair through my sense organs. But if you really get one with the chair, maybe. Analogously, whereas I can arbitrarily stipulate that a hood isn't integral to the coat it's attached to, I cannot just decide that a patch of my skin isn't integral to me as an individual subject. Well, you can decide that, it just might not manifest that way. For, whether I like it or not, I do immediately feel what happens in the patch. Metaphysically speaking, thus, there are no such things as individual inanimate objects that could correspond to disassociated waters of the universal will. Yeah, I'm inclined to disagree with that, but fair enough. That's a reasonable position. Admittedly, if read cursorily, some passages of Schopenhauer's may seem to suggest that individual inanimate objects have private conscious inner lives of their own, but only if read cursorily. Consider, for instance, this passage. Now let us consider attentively and observe the powerful, irresistible. Okay, I'll try again. Now let us consider, Now let us consider attentively and observe the powerful, irresistible impulse with which masses of water rush downwards, the persistence and determination with which the magnet always turns back to the North Pole, the keen desire with which iron flies to the magnet, the vehemence with which the poles of the electric current strive for reunion. Well, I mean, Gaia probably feels alive. She might not appreciate this passage. No, she might not appreciate the idea that she's not alive. And she doesn't appreciate flat earth theorists either. I'm sure she loves them too. Commenting on this passage, Jenna Way contends that Schopenhauer cannot possibly mean that iron really desires anything, or that water rushes because it wants to. 2002. Well, maybe not, but she's assuming. For Jenna Way, the notion that there is something it is like to be an individual river or a magnet or piece of iron separate from the rest of the inanimate universe is merely embarrassing. Well, she can go on a limitation if she likes. And indeed, Schopenhauer clearly doesn't mean this at all, but not for the reason Jenna Way seems to assume. The problem is not that the inner essence of inanimate nature, even when taken as a whole, cannot be experiential, but that ultimately there are no separate inanimate objects such as rivers, magnets, or pieces of iron. With the passage quoted above, Schopenhauer is saying merely that the universal laws of nature, as locally manifested in the effects of gravitation in particular bodies of water, and of electromagnetism in particular, magnets and pieces of iron, are the objectification of equally universal volitional states. There isn't anything it is like to be a river or a magnet in and of itself, but there is only something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. These universal volitional states manifest themselves as gravitational and electromagnetic attraction, which in turn have local effects in what our intellectual cognizes as particular bodies of water and magnets. If you read the passage above again, with this clarification in mind, you will see what Schopenhauer is trying to say. But I would keep in mind that while maybe a river as a whole isn't conscious, individual particles might be, even though truly they form waves and fields. There might be something to that, although maybe not. There's an alternative way of looking at it, which is that when you get to subatomic particles, which are the way they're affected by quantum mechanics, because they tend to work, they might pop in one place and appear in another place, disappear and appear in another place, and all that stuff. They the way quantum particles act and interact is so strange that perhaps it doesn't really make sense for it to even be an incarnation in, or for a soul to have an incarnation within a subatomic particle. Perhaps that's too small, and perhaps they start off maybe on a molecular level rather than on as a single atom. Maybe. And maybe actually it's on the 8th density that in an holistic way that the universal forces, let's say electromagnetism and stuff like that, are experienced from the top, not from the bottom. Or maybe both at the same time. Maybe it's a point where it is, after all, a point where octaves connect. So anyway. The point here is important, for some construe Schopenhauer's metaphysics to imply some form of constitutive panpsychism, i.e. the notion that subatomic particles are already fundamentally conscious in and by themselves, and then somehow combine to form higher level subjects of experience, such as you and me. I find this interpretation as perplexing as it is untenable, for Schopenhauer insists repeatedly that there is only one universal will or consciousness, the one eye of the world which looks out from all knowing creatures, the one being of nature. There are no fundamentally separate units of consciousness corresponding to individual inanimate objects such as subatomic particles. There aren't even individual inanimate objects outside the mere representation of the intellect to begin with. Well, I'm a client. I see where they're coming from, but like, given what I've read and heard and all that regarding the raw material, I'm inclined to disagree. So I might have to like, go purely with this, I might have to discount like the raw material as a source and channeled material as a source, or that as a legit channeled material. And I'm not really inclined to do that. So, I mean, maybe there's a way to unify both perspectives. Don't precisely know what that is, but it might be the idea that when it's subatomic, it's not consciously, you know, like what I said about it, but maybe on a molecular level, but not on a subatomic level, maybe. I don't really know. There is thus no way around our earlier conclusion. Inanimate objects do not count as alters of the universal will, for there is no metaphysical basis for their individuation. Only living organisms have private, i.e. disassociated conscious inner lives of their own, if you say so. But then, do all living organisms count as alters? The question, well, pardon me for saying so many things wrong, but then, do all living organisms count as alters? The answer is yes, insofar as all living organisms, A, maintain their form while constantly exchanging material with the environment, and B, are enclosed in some sort of porous boundary that demarcates them from this environment, so that they, C, can have private experiential states disassociated from the environment. According to Schopenhauer, even plants are disassociated experiential states, although very simple. We must picture to ourselves the subjective existence of the plant as a weak analog, a mere shadow of the comfortable and uncomfortable feeling. And even if in this extremely weak degree, the plant knows only of itself, not of anything outside it. I mean, say that to Venus flytraps. Okay, yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that it's responding to stimulus, right? But still, I don't think it's clear cut as they're saying. This implies a dissociative boundary that carves out the inner conscious life of the plant from its outside environment. According to Schopenhauer, the level of disassociation of a living organism from the universal background of uniform laws can be discerned in the strength of the organism's character, its degree of differentiation from said background. Whereas the inanimate universe complies with overarching uniform causal patterns, the dissociated alter has its own local idiosyncratic behavioral tendencies and dispositions, its own impulses or laws of behavior, so to speak, which set it apart from the behavior of the rest of the universe. It is disassociation that enables such localized differentiation. And of course, the multitude of different expressions of the one are inevitable given that the one includes all that is and thus all possibilities. Mainstream present-day thought would have us believe that the character of living things too is ultimately determined by the action, e.g. in brains of the same universal forces that determine the behavior of inorganic nature. This, if true, would invalidate the notion of character as used by Schopenhauer, for the latter entails that a living organism's behavior is not reducible to universal physical laws. We shall certainly find that in the organism traces of chemical and physical modes of operation. We shall never explain the organism from these, because it is by no means a phenomenon brought about by the united operation of such forces, and therefore by accident, but a higher idea that has subdued these lower ones through overwhelming assimilation. In other words, the character of a living organism, as demarcated by disassociation, is not the bottom-up aggregate of the operation of universal physical forces, but results instead from the overwhelming top-down influence of higher-level volitional states on the behavior of the organism. Counter to the current mainstream thinking as it may be, this postulate of Schopenhauer's is not, and arguably can never be, disproven. But they might say, well, it can't be disproven, but it's not about it being disproven, it's about it being proven. It has to be, was it, falsifiable, right? That's what they'd say. So, obviously there's the materialist version of bottom-up, which is emergence, where the nature of an organism, it sort of emerges upwards from interactions of particles and proteins and all that. There is another version of the bottom-up where you say that it's consciousness rising into more, would you say, advanced forms. But I would suggest that it's a two-way process between consciousness rising and all that is above directing, let's say, the orchestra. There's each instrument and each person playing music, and then there's the conductors, right? Maybe one conductor above all that, who knows? And it is all one orchestra, right? But it's made up of each and every interacting musician playing. Without each individual one of their actions, it can't be this music you're hearing can't be heard, right? Or at least it'd be different without one musician playing, right? The composition would be different. It wouldn't be the same thing if like a fundamental chord is just missing from a whole. But at the same time, there is this top-down direction of it to make sure, well, I mean, there's like laws of reality and shit, right? And different levels of consciousness affect reality in different ways, and there's this interaction between every levels. Now, what it reminds me of is this idea of holons. This is something that, oh, what's the guy's name called? The guy who came up with talking about integral theory and stuff. I know the guy. I don't know him personally. I know the idea. I know the idea, the concept. But what is a holon? You look up holons and integral theory, you'll find out who the guy is I'm talking about. It's basically the idea that a holon is like a part of a whole, but it was also the whole at the same time. I know it sounds paradoxical, but it's like a part that is a whole in itself. Now, if you consider what a soul is on one hand a sovereign individual, but on the other hand, it's part of a whole simultaneously. So I feel that the concept of holons is very useful here. It's a pity I can't recall the guy's name off the top of my head, but whatever. I hope he doesn't die before I interview him. Just saying. Anyway, where was I? Indeed, today it is simply assumed that the basic laws of physics demonstrated to hold at a microscopic level are solely responsible for the behavior of macroscopic systems in a causally closed manner. In other words, it is merely assumed that there is nothing about the weather, astronomical phenomena, my or your behavior that cannot be explained in terms of the properties of subatomic particles. But this assumption cannot be verified due to the exponential explosion of mathematical dimensionality and complexity. A subatomic level simulation of, say, my or your nervous system, which could be compared to our observed behavior in real life, would take, to put it very mildly, impractically long to perform. Even if we assumed barely realistic future advancements in computing power, the complexity of the task is just mind-boggling. So we do not really know if observations are at a macroscopic level would turn out consistent with our microscopic theory of everything, as acknowledged by Milieu et al. The question of whether some macroscopic laws may be fundamental statements about nature, may be deduced from some theory of everything, remains a topic of debate among scientists. And certainly, as we've been seeing with my readings of Quantum Theory and Free Will by Henry B. Stapp, there's this, there have been consistent attempts to have a theory of everything that is simultaneously materialistic or physicalist. That explains quantum phenomena or phenomena on the micro level in a physicalist way, that treats a quantum strangeness that you get, especially with the Copenhagen interpretation, as at most a pragmatic set of rules to do calculations by, rather than a description of reality. Because if the way observation affects reality via the Born rule and stuff like that, if it were actually, you know, and Heisenberg talked, was it Heisenberg? Von Neumann talks about this process 1 and process 2 thing, where the possibilities are kind of, which possibility is collapsed into is kind of affected by the consciousness of the observer. If that were to truly be recognized as actually going on, they would not be able to retain realism. Realism is essentially what it refers to in this context would be materialism and physicalism. realism and anti-realism. Anti-realism, they align to like materialism and idealism, I would say. There's a difference, and you can look it up, but in philosophy, there's a difference there. Anyway, and philosophy and also physics. So, although I could say that realism isn't really real, but okay. So they're these, they're trying to explain it in that way and connect up the micro with the macro in a way that's consistent with that. And is it really doable? That is being debated now, you know, and I would suggest it's not really doable, at least not if they retain materialism. What they're going to have to do is recognize that it's not just a set of rules, all this observation affecting reality stuff. And like, it really is like quite like what Copenhagen interpretation describes. And there's attempts with things like Bohmian mechanics to get around this, but it's like, it makes it more complicated to even do that. And fundamentally, it's very much reminiscent of attempts to explain away things by this Neoplatonic idea of the solar system, where geocentric idea of the solar system, where everything revolves around Earth, including the sun, and then going to weird epicycle movements in order to explain their movements through the heavens as observed through telescopes. It's that the oversimplification, because at first it was like hidden variable theory was like that there's just fundamentally hidden mechanics behind everything, still without there being a god somehow, and that the Schrödinger equation is like this hidden mechanics behind everything determining what's happening, and we just don't know what they are yet. We just don't know. It's just unknown, but it's something going on, right? And that, but it was proven that that doesn't really work without non-locality, i.e. without things that aren't in the same place being connected on a level that goes against locality. So locality was sacrificed in order to maintain the paradigm of realism or materialism or physicalism. And the thing is, in order to make it, to keep the theory coherent, what they had to do was add more complications and a really complicated way of explaining it, just to retain this idea of, now, actually, I'll see if I can actually quote it, because it does seem relevant here. Oh man, I don't want to be spending too much time. They're just like trying to find it. So oh, okay, there it is. Right, I think this is it. So I guess this is a reading of two different texts. I've already done this in the other text, but this is relevant, so I'll do it again. Bohm himself addressed this problem, was forced, no, I'll go back one paragraph actually. If science is properly about growing knowledge, then the theory is fundamentally incomplete, for it offers no rational account of how the physical description that it provides is tied to evolving mentally described knowledge, and how, if at all, our mental intentions influence the activities of our brains, and hence bodies. Bohm himself addressed this problem and was forced to replace his original simple non-local theory by a very complex one in which the mystery of the mind is transferred to a mystery about an infinite tower of observing systems, each observing what's physically happening in the level just below. The simplicity and attractiveness of his original quasi-classical quantum theory was lost when he tried to incorporate our human experiences. You know, kind of important, that bit. But incorporating our causally effective mental intentions is exactly what realistically construed orthodox quantum mechanics achieves. that form of quantum mechanics is the form of quantum mechanics is basically like this whole thing where observations affect reality, which is like the law of attraction, by the way. Yeah, that's actually a description of reality. And the mental state of the observer in all its different forms, like that affects like the collapse of the superposition and what possibility is that it's not random, that it's based, that the collapse is based on the mental states. And this brings us to the realm of mentalism, the law of attraction, panpsychism, the law of one and shit like that. So that's the problem they've got, is that, in fact, they're kind of desperately trying to avoid that. They really want to maintain this physicalist paradigm. And even Bohemian mechanics can't really do that, or at least to the extent that it does, it overcomplicates things to even maintain the paradigm. I'll finish off this paragraph. It offers a rationally coherent, mathematically formulated description of reality that includes an account of how our mental attentions influence our physical behavior in a way that is concordant with all the empirical evidence, instead of defaming us by claiming that our most important human quality, the capacity of our mental intentions to influence our bodily actions, an illusion or delusion. The price to pay for this increase in rational understanding is a failure of Einstein's classical physics-based intuition that information cannot travel faster than light. But in quantum mechanics, one has, instead, the property that no signal, send a chosen message, can be sent faster than light. This weaker property of quantum mechanics suffices to maintain in the quantum world the essential empirical requirements of the theory of relativity. So here we are. I feel like that was relevant and helpful. So I'm going to carry on. Actually, how much is left of this chapter? I mean, it feels like a bit of a longer one than some of the others. Oh, we're almost at the end, but I don't know. Will I stop at the end of this chapter or carry on? I don't know. So, as acknowledged by Milegou et al., the question of whether some macroscopic laws may be fundamental statements about nature or may be deduced from some theory of everything remains a topic of debate among scientists. More specifically, considering the character of organisms, Robert Lorcan and David Pines, 2000, argued that it is and shall remain impossible to demonstrate that the behavior of living beings can be fully modeled by a physical theory of everything and its associated equations. Now, keep in mind, it said physical theory of everything. We can have a spiritual theory of everything. And I'm sure you're aware of what that might be, or what I'm suggesting or implying there. Predicting the behavior of the human brain from these equations is patently absurd. We have succeeded in reducing all of ordinary physical behavior to simple, correct theory of everything, only to discover that it has revealed exactly nothing about many things of great importance. So, what's the purpose of a theory? To actually explain reality and help us understand it. And there's a reason why science is done. It's not just simply learning for its own sake. There's an application, there's a benefit from it, right? There's no benefit if it just combines it together but doesn't tell us anything new. I mean, what's the point? For all we can know, thus, Schopenhauer may be correct that character cannot be reduced to universal physical laws. It may indeed be a local differentiation from the uniform universal background of forces. And so, like, that connects to the idea, I would say, of there's an all that is source, and then there's each soul being source, or a piece of it, or a fingerprint of it, let's say. And there's a multitude of different expressions, of forms, and so forth, of all that is, inevitably, because it's all that is, right? And we are different expressions of that. Different expressions, different parts of the whole that is all that is. A particular character can be discerned in a species as a whole, such as in the case of plants, or even in particular individuals, such as in the case of higher animals and human beings. In either case, however, there is always a degree of differentiation from the universal background of laws and forces, which is part of what defines organisms as individual subjects. Inanimate nature, on the other hand, embodies merely the universality of these laws and forces, uniformly applicable throughout space-time. Character is a manifestation of a local dissociative process unfolding in the universal will. Wherever character is discernible, there is an alter of the will. And because only living organisms are alters, the notions of dissociation, life, and character are highly intertwined in Schopenhauer's metaphysics. To sum it all up, all living organisms are dissociated alters of the will, each manifesting a character. But only living organisms, not inanimate objects, are individual subjects. Well, can we be sure about that? I'm not sure, but it's a reasonable case that they're making. Now, some of these individual subjects are capable only of reactions to stimuli, plants. Others are also capable of perceptual representations, animals, and some are capable of even abstract representations, humans. Nonetheless, all are alters of the universal will. So that's the end of the chapter. So what we got next? What we're next is chapter 11, an overarching conceptual framework. I'll give you a little spoiler, just to tease you a little bit. So here's a diagram from the next chapter. I haven't even looked at it really much. This is will at large in different alters, and it's great. It's elaborating further on that with an overarching conceptual framework, which ties in the other stuff we're talking about so far as well. So that should be interesting. But I feel like, and in this episode for now, well, and in this episode, I want to do more readings of this. And yeah, I wish you well, love and kindness and inner peace and all that. And bye for now.